At first glance, the difficulty system in RimWorld looks pretty simple. You pick one of the default difficulties and you start a new run. But under the hood, there's a surprisingly complex system that determines how difficult your game is at any given moment. The game tracks a number it calls raid points. The storyteller uses these raid points to set how many raiders you will face, as well as what kind of equipment and extra loot they will be carrying. The truth is, unless you play on peaceful, no matter what level difficulty you choose, your raids will eventually reach the same point. You could be playing on base builder or with custom difficulty at 500% threat scale, and sooner or later, your raids will reach the same level of difficulty. Let's start by taking a look at how raid points are determined. Raid points are calculated by taking your wealth points, added with your pawn points, and multiplying this by your difficulty, the starting factor, and the adaption factor. Throughout the rest of this video, we'll discuss the various components of this equation, and at the end, we'll discuss a few techniques for minimizing raid points by manipulating parts of this equation. The first variable of the raid point equation is wealth. Wealth is the total value of all the items, pawns, and half the total value of all claim structures on the map. When it comes to item wealth, it will calculate the value of every single item in the tile your base is settled in. This includes the items in your stockpile, as well as the items that are left sitting out on the map. It also includes all of the items that are currently equipped on your pawns. You can see how much wealth each pawn in your colony is worth by going into their information panel. Keep in mind that it will calculate the wealth of all creatures, not just your humans. It will also include pets, farm animals, dryads, and any robots that you're currently using. The base number is shown in your colony statistics panel. Here's a more concise look at how the storyteller is calculating wealth using an equation. The next variable is pawn points. Pawn points are separate points added for each pawn in your colony. Keep in mind, this is in addition to the wealth of the pawn that we just took a look at. Each adult colonist is going to add 15 pawn points if your colony wealth is under 10,000, and then begins to scale up to 140 points at 400,000 wealth. Past 400,000, it continues to scale up to 200 pawn points per adult pawn at 1 million wealth. So the more colony wealth you have, the more each pawn will count towards difficulty. A simple equation for determining what each pawn is worth relative to wealth is 15 plus wealth minus 10,000 divided by 3,120. If you think of an adult colonist as our baseline, then comparatively, pawns in cryptosleep will be at 30% of a normal colonist. Children have a multiplier that raises with age. It starts at 0% as babies and stays at 0% until age 3, then begins to rise, reaching 50% at age 13, and continues to rise to 100% by the time they reach age 18. Slaves will only count for 75%. Prisoners and quest visitors do not count toward pawn points. Animals with attack count for 8% of their attack power value. Mechs count for 20% to 40% of their combat power value, depending on the total wealth the storyteller is using to calculate raid points. From 0 to 10,000 wealth, this will be 20%. At 400,000 wealth, you'll have reached 30%, and at 1 million, you'll be at 40% of their combat power. To view the various combat power of mechs, refer to the RimWorld wiki page on the Mechanoid Hive. Dryads don't count for pawn points, giving them one advantage over mechs and animals. The variable labeled difficulty in the equation refers to the threat scale that you choose when you create a new game. Strive to Survive is a 1x multiplier, and Losing is Fun is a 2.2x multiplier. You can go into custom settings and raise this all the way up to a 5 times multiplier. There's not a lot more to unpack with this one, other than the fact that it will never change unless you go into your storyteller settings and change it manually. Starting factor is also a pretty simple one to explain. It starts off at its lowest value at the beginning of the game, and then increases as the game time goes on. This makes your game harder the longer you play. Before day 10, your entire raid point equation will be multiplied by 0.7. After day 40, this will increase to 1, negating your early game raid point reduction. Adaption is the last variable of the raid point equation, and unfortunately, one of the most complicated parts of the difficulty system, so I'll try to be brief without getting too deep in the weeds. If you want to skip this part, then all you need to know is that this variable goes down whenever a pawn is downed, or dies, and this variable goes up over time when these things do not happen. If you're interested in the details, then this next part is for you. It has two components that are determined when you're choosing your starting difficulty. These are adaption factor and adaption impact. Adaption factor by default ranges from 0.4 to 1.47, meaning at 100% impact, it will multiply your equation by 0.4 at its lowest factor and by 1.47 at its highest factor. When you're playing on Losing is Fun, you will have an adaption impact of 40%, meaning adaption factor will range from 0.75 to 1.19. Every time a pawn is downed or killed, adaption will lower a value called adaption days, based on a set value that is determined by how many colonists you have in your colony. Under 11 population, when a pawn dies, it will reduce adapt days by 30. By the time you have 20 pawns, this value scales down to 20. The same thing will occur when a pawn is injured, except at a lower value. When you have 1 pawn, 8 adapt days are removed. By the time you reach 11 pawns, this will reduce to 5 adapt days, and goes all the way down to 3.5 adapt days at 20 pawns. When adapt days are below 0, the game will add 1.5 adapt days per 12 hours until it reaches 0, at which point it will add 0.5 adapt days. Once it reaches 60, this goes down to 0.25 per 12 hours, and reduces again at 120 down to 0.125 per 12 hours. Adapt days can lower to minus 60 and go all the way up to 100 when no deaths or injuries occur. At minus 30 or below, adaptation factor will be at its lowest value and will reach its highest value at 100 adapt days. If you start the game at 100% adaptation impact and have 100 days without incident, you'll reach the highest value of 1.47. It's this adaptation value that is going to be used in the raid points calculation, and will act as another multiplier to raid points. Here's the chart to help you understand the range of adaptation factor. As an example, assume you're playing with 100% adaptation impact. You have a colony of 25 pawns, and you have reached the maximum 100 adapt days. This will give you the maximum adaptation factor. It would take 5 pawns dying to reach 0 adapt days, an additional 2 pawns dying to get to the lowest adaptation factor of 0.4. Alternatively, it would require pawns being down 37 times to reach the lowest factor for maximum. As a final note, slaves and quest pawns don't count towards raid points, but they're still considered colonists when determining adaptation. You can view your raid points by going into development mode, open view settings, click right storyteller, and click the magnifying glass. Raid points will cap at 10,000. This is what eventually causes all runs to converge on the same level of difficulty. By now you can see how it will take significantly longer to reach that point on the lowest difficulty setting, while being a much shorter time to reach on the highest difficulty setting. One final note about raid points before we move on to difficulty management tips. If you're playing on Randy Random, then you'll experience an additional modifier that will randomly modify raid points by a random value between 50 and 150%. This will occur to every problem causer event that you experience, meaning that you can receive some massive endgame raids on Randy that the other storytellers wouldn't send you. Only accept pawns that will fulfill a role in the colony. The more pawns you add, the harder your game will become. If you accept inadequate pawns, then the utility they add will not outweigh the difficulty increase. Don't stockpile large amounts of food. This is a trap that many new players fall into. Try to keep only enough supplies to survive 1 or 2 emergencies beyond the immediate future. You want to keep enough food to survive something that happens to your production chain, and on top of this, you want to consider keeping supplies for a toxic fallout or volcanic winter. Beyond these 2 problems, there's no reason to keep extra supplies in the colony. Destroy weapons and armor that are not going to be used in the near future. Clear the map of corpses and items. Even if it's not in a stockpile, items sitting on your map will increase the wealth count. And oddly enough, so do unrotten corpses. Don't mine more than you intend on using in the immediate future. Steel, uranium, and components cost quite a bit, while silver, gold, and plasteel will skyrocket your wealth, and they do nothing while sitting in your stockpile. Be careful how many bionics and architect parts you install on your pawns. It's often not worth installing a bionic just for the sake of installing a bionic. Save these for any time a pawn loses a limb or suffers severe scarring. You can give body modder pawns a cochlear implant to get rid of the mood penalty, and give a nice buff without raising their wealth value. Give out gifts to traders at every opportunity. This will trade wealth for goodwill. Goodwill adds no wealth but can be traded for useful caravans or reinforcements via the comms console. As an extension of this, use transport pods to drop items on your friends to get rid of the wealth and trade it for goodwill. This acts as a long-range gift. Adaption can be manipulated by keeping a throwaway colonist or slaves to be used to purposely lower the adaptation factor, by downing them or, well, you get the idea. Keep in mind the total wealth of all the items and structures you're using to keep a pawn's mood up. Generally, you want to commit the smallest amount of wealth possible to keep the pawn's mood slightly above their break threshold. You want to have a small buffer in case things go wrong, but it isn't worthwhile to keep their mood as high as possible, since the benefit does not outweigh the cost. After all, the only real benefit of high mood is the chance for inspiration, and these are rarely worth the investment cost. That's it for difficulty mechanics. I hope this video gave you a bit better insight into what is making your raids more difficult. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed it, make sure you press the like button, subscribe for more videos like this one.